Kyle Klingman with Track Wrestling. We are going all the way out to Maryland and the Capital Wrestling Club with Coach Jon Morrison, who went from the south side of Chicago to Oklahoma State to Michigan. Now you're in Maryland. We'll track a little bit of that progress, but my understanding is you got involved in wrestling because of professional wrestling. You thought you were going to be jumping off rings. So
Yeah.
that begs the question, who are your favorite pro wrestlers when you started out?
Oh man, let me think. So that was when it used to be WWF and WCW. My dad and I used to watch all the time. I used to like Sting a lot. I think his name was Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid. But some of those, yeah.
So you really thought when you were first getting in, I've heard that before where they think it's going to be pro wrestling and then they're shocked. What did you think when you first found out it wasn't pro wrestling?
I mean, that's, we get there and there's no ring, right? And, I remember this. It was like, I think I was maybe 7 or 8. And I asked my dad, I'm like, what is this, And he said, why don't you just give it a try? One of his good friends, great guy, my first wrestling coach, his name was Ray Briscoe. And, you're just a great coach. And I really took a liking to it. And I think I was, pretty successful at it right away, I think. And then, as you get older, right? I mean, my dad's 5'8", my mom's 5'2", maybe, or my dad, maybe not even 5'8". That might be generous, but, so it's like, I knew I wasn't going to be playing football, right? I was a good baseball player when I was younger. And then it got to a certain point, maybe 7th or 8th grade, when I started wrestling more in the summer and wasn't able to do travel baseball. And then I think, 8th grade, I just really focused on wrestling.
What's wrestling like on the south side of Chicago?
It's a lot of good wrestling, man. I mean, I grew up, wrestling for a club, Calumet City Wolverines, and then moved over to Tinley Park Bulldogs, and just really stiff competition, man. I can remember, almost every weekend, coming up, like myself, BJ Futrell was really good at that time. Tony Ramos, and actually Jimmy Kennedy's sister Kendra was really good. We used to wrestle sometimes, but it was like almost every weekend I'm wrestling those guys, right? And then, through high school too, and even through college with Tony and I, and all 3 of us competed senior level. So, it was like you really didn't have to leave Illinois very much. There's so many tournaments now, and it's like I tell the kids, it's like I think too many parents focus on sending their kids to every tournament and getting 200 matches in a year instead of like really getting better and focusing on development, not so much being results oriented. But that was the great thing about having such good competition in Chicago and in Illinois in general. We would leave the state a couple times. We would go to Kickoff Classic, Tulsa Nationals, and then if I won those 2, my dad would take me to Reno as like a reward, and then we would do like a freestyle nationals in the summer. But that was about it, man. I mean, you didn't really have to venture too far to get good competition,
When I think of different states, of course, every state has an identity, but it seems like Illinois really has a special identity. Part of it could be the talent, but it just seems like they really have a team atmosphere. And maybe that's part of it because there isn't a individual state tournament that gets counted or tabulated. They have the individual, but it's not a part of a team scoring. Do you think that's why they build team bonds a little bit better?
I think, so when I was coming up, I grew up wrestling, for Sean Bourmet. We had team overtime in Illinois, and, Sean and John Kading and Ed Geezy, and some of those other people, Don Reynolds, that were involved with Illinois USAW, they did a really great job of getting the best guys to buy in. I think we won junior duels 3 out of 4 years I was in high school. I think we won cadet duels a few times. But the big thing was getting buy-in from all the best kids in the state. Do I think Illinois is that much better than Pennsylvania or Ohio that we win junior duels in Fargo every year? I don't think that. It's just I think the leadership, people buy in, and you get the best kids to wrestle, right? And that's half the battle is getting the good kids out, But, yeah, so I think – and honestly, after being around, going some different places, I think, it's great that they do so well in Fargo, right? But looking at it objectively, and I've told some of my friends that coach high school in Illinois this, there's such a a disconnect between like the East Coast and Illinois. And I think, when I was younger and even in high school, it was like, take them down, let them go. Right. And it was such a focus on neutral wrestling. There just wasn't that emphasis on top and bottom, and it probably took me a good, really 2 or 3 years in that Oklahoma State room. And it wasn't that I didn't have great coaching. I did. I was fortunate, to be around some of the best, but it was just, I think, a culture in Illinois where, you just didn't put the emphasis in on turning. It was like, if you want to run up the score, you let the kid go and take him down again, as opposed to, learning how to ride single wrist or ride legs and turn these guys. And now, especially in college with 4-point near fall, if you want to be really good and you want to come out as a freshman and be an All-American, you got to be good on the mat, man. There's just too many good guys. I can remember wrestling some guys in college, like, AJ Shop from Edinburgh. He's one guy. I mean, wasn't that, I think he'll tell you too himself, I don't think I'm insulting him. He wasn't very exceptional on his feet, but on the mat, he was a bear, man, and he was 3 or 4-time All-American. So you have those guys, right, that, they're not going to come out and wrestle you on their feet. And maybe they just try to keep the score close and they make a living, mat wrestling. And I think you do see that these prep schools being out east here, schools like Blair, Wyoming, Sem, these kids, they've seen it all, by the time they get to college, right? So it's less of an adjustment, I think.
You mentioned some really good names there of some Illinois kids, and a lot of times they don't stay in state. You went to Oklahoma State. Why do you think Illinois schools have not been able to box in the best talent?
Man, it's an interesting question, I think some of it's circumstance, right? I mean, I had some things, and each kid is different. I can't speak for, some of the other people that have left the state, but, I had some different family things, and it was just best for me at that time to get away, and then, it was tough. It's like, you got to decide what's important to you. And when I was coming out of high school, the training situation at Oklahoma State was just, it was unbelievable. It was Obi Blanc, Coleman Scott, Jordan Oliver, Eric Guerrero. And then, you have Coach Smith, right, who I grew up, my first wrestling coach, I mentioned him earlier, Ray, he taught us how low can you go. That was what I learned wrestling on. So, when he comes into your living room, it's hard to say no, man. And you get to know him on a personal level, and, he's a larger than life character, right? And to get to learn from him and just be in that environment at Oklahoma State, it's just, if wrestling's important to you and that's the priority, which it was for me, it's hard to turn down, man. Just, you're surrounded by greatness, right? And it's a culture there, and people love wrestling and a lot of support. And it was a great experience, man. I wouldn't trade it for anything.
When did you learn about Jon Smith? If you started with knowing about pro wrestling, when did you learn about Jon Smith through that?
So, shortly after, right, like that first or second year, I can remember my coach showing us, hey, I watched this on How Low Can You Go, and showing us low single and some of the different finishes and stuff. And so really is like from probably year 1 or 2 that I started wrestling, I knew Coach Smith, and then, seeing them win 4 in a row when I was kind of like in elementary school. And, I was a big fan of Coleman. I can remember him, pinning Joe Slayton in the bottom leg cradle in the NCAA finals. And I'm like, man, I want to be around this guy. And, and I had known Jordan through like Fargo and some of those, things like that. And it was just the right fit for me.
You glad you went there? I mean, you were an All-American there and had some great workout partners. Was it ultimately the right fit?
I think so. I mean, you could always look back and, certain things you maybe do different, but overall I had a good career. I think everybody looks back and they think, man, I really wish I would have, won a title or, Big regret I have is that we didn't win a team title. We came close a couple times. I think we got second maybe twice, scored 120 points my junior year and couldn't beat Penn State, but, just to be a part of that, the Oklahoma State tradition and just all the people, really what I take from it is all the great people that I met from my time there. Of course I'll remember the wrestling and the teammates, but, like I look back on, being a homesick freshman and people like, Zach and Matt White and his family, that, inviting me over for the holidays, Coach Smith taking me to his parents' house in Del City, the Perrys having me over. There's just such a good community of people there, and those relationships are lifelong. It's everybody's doing their own thing, and you may not talk to everybody as often as you'd like, but those relationships I'll always cherish, right? So I wouldn't trade for the world.
You go to Michigan, but now you are in the D.C. area. You have a club right outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. How do you get there? How do you connect the dots and find yourself going from south side of Chicago to ultimately Maryland?
Yeah, so kind of a crazy story. After the 2016, I left Oklahoma State. I moved out east for 1 year here and coached a prep school with my friend Corey Cooperman and Rob Eiter. We coached at a school called St. Paul's for 1 year. And then, I was talking to Sean again and was like, man, I feel like, I can remember watching the trials in 17. And I'm like, man, I feel like I could beat these guys, so I moved to Ann Arbor, trained for a few years, competed, got to go overseas a bunch and really learned a lot more, made myself a better coach. And, then from some of the people that I met out here previously, the opportunity came up. A couple guys were looking to start a wrestling club. One guy you may know, his name is Max Meltzer. He wrestled at Harvard in the mid-2000s. He was a All-American at 141. So he's one of my partners with the club. And then another guy named Scott Kirsch, who was actually George Mason's first All-American in the mid-90s. But they're just really, they love wrestling, really supportive of wrestling in the area. Max is from here, raising his family here, and I think he wanted to get back involved with the sport. And, it's been a really great opportunity, man, and just being around people that are really, want to see the sport grow, and they don't really have anything that they want to get out of it, which is refreshing. And, it's been good, right? I mean, we've Helen's from this area here too. She grew up like 5 minutes from the club here, so she was kind of home for the holidays and just, we kind of started rolling around a little bit. And then, she's like, hey, I kind of like this, and she's back with her family now, so she's been training here too, and helping us coach, and it's been good. I'm learning, and it's you see there's a lot of differences between coaching and wrestling that people don't really think about, right? It's like, the on the mat stuff is easy. I've been blessed to be around some of the best coaches in the world. So it's like the teaching is easy. It's the other stuff that you kind of got to learn. And competing is such a selfish thing, right? And coaching is a selfless thing. So it's just, I know that's cliche, but it's true, so it's been kind of just learning. But I enjoy it.
How's that work out with Helen? That's pretty cool that you have the first and only Olympic champion from the United States in women's freestyle wrestling. Do you train her, or is she just part of the program?
No, we train, and then she helps coach the youth and high school kids with me. And I'll tell you what, she's incredible. I mean, just number one, technically, she's so far ahead of these other girls, and she's just as much as she's accomplished, she still is just so humble. Like, that's what's really impressed me about her is, just even with everything she's done, right? Like you said, she's one of the best women's wrestlers ever, pioneer in the sport. She's still always trying to learn, and, it's been really cool to pick her brain and kind of I think what sets her apart, obviously, like I said, technically and athletically, she's exceptional, but what really sets her apart, I think, and makes her that, 1% of 1% Olympic gold medalist is between the ears. She's just mentally strong, right? I mean, and I think that's what she really brings to the table for our kids. We have some really, really tough prep school kids and some tough youth kids that come into the club, and just hearing her explain like, hey, these are some of the things I've went through in my journey in this sport. And, I could see it in you guys, and just how she can relay that to them. And, I'll be honest, if I was a Division I head coach, she would be my first hire as an assistant coach. And I know that's a little bit outside of the box, but just the way she can relate to the guys in a way that I can't, and get them to kind of open up and be a little bit more vulnerable. I mean, she just brings a ton of value, and she's a great person, really fun to have around too. So it's been a pleasure, it's been my pleasure. And, we hope we could keep her around for a long time. So
when you talk philosophy and you talk about technique, you mentioned Coleman Scotty earlier. I've heard that he is an absolute technical monster, that he knows technique like no other. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, man. I mean, just, being in that Oklahoma State room, and definitely Coleman was phenomenal, and really, really helped me a lot in my career. Just, a lot of butt whoopings at first. But yeah, man, he's a wizard, I mean, just, and really good at relating to the guys too. You'll come across some people who are good technically, but they can't really like break it down and teach it to other people. And I always thought Coleman was great. I mean, really though, you don't see too many guys that come out of that room after being with Coach Smith for 4 or 5 years and aren't good technically. It's just, he's a different level, man, and you see like, it's interesting being around him, and then being around Sergey Belyaev at Michigan. One guy's a 6-time world champ, other guy's an 8-time world champ, and kind of what you see with them is like, obviously they're good athletes, and they had, again, just like I was talking about with Helen, they have some things that set them apart, right? But like their attention to detail when they teach technique, he does this, you do this, he does this, you do this. It's like everybody else is playing checkers and these guys are playing chess, and it really is like almost a savant. I remember being amazed a few times, like Coach Smith, when I was in college, I remember like certain things you were really starting to see more that I don't think were really popular in like the 80s or 90s. Like, guys, you were seeing a lot more funk because of Askren and some of these guys at Missouri, passing legs, guys doing claw rides on top. And Coach Smith, you would just kind of see him. He would kind of like, he could watch it. And then he's like, okay, this is what you do, and it was like, nobody showed him that because it's new technique. People have not been passing legs, and diving under for 20 years. This is new stuff in 2009, 2010. And he's watching. He's like, okay, you don't want to let the guy split your legs. You got to get all the way to the other side here, start cross facing, just to see how he would work through things and problem solve. I mean, you see why he is who he is, and same thing with Belyaev.
Yeah, take me through that. Like, I'm super fascinated by this. So you have Sergey Belyaev, 8-time world and Olympic champion from the Soviet Union. Jon Smith from the United States, 6-time world and Olympic champion. Compare and contrast them. How do they do things the same? How do they do things different?
I think it all starts with skill. Coach Smith used to tell us all the time, and I think I don't think Sergey ever verbalized this to me, but I think just, going through his workouts and his training, I think his philosophy was the same. Like, you got to be – Coach Smith used to say, I can show you every move in the world, but if you're not raw bone tough, you'll never be worth a damn. You'll be mediocre, right? So he's like, you got to be tough. You got to be in shape. You got to be strong enough. You got to be fast enough. Those things are a given. But ultimately, what's going to win and what's going to separate you is your technique and your skill, So that was – we spent a lot of time just – more than other programs, I think, less live wrestling, more drilling, more technique, more skill work. And, that's what I do with our guys too. Obviously there's certain times of the year you got to pick the pace up. You got to be in shape. There's got to be some conditioning and live, but, I'm a big believer in let's get in shape by wrestling and drilling and doing stuff that's going to actually make you better at wrestling, you know, as opposed to just running and putting in a lot of miles. So I think if I could, you know, I guess similarities, right, is, you know, technique is what's going to win and what's going to separate you. I think maybe a little bit of differences. One thing I was, you know, really that was different about Sergey was we did a lot of upper body stuff, feet to back, you know, and I just think you don't see that dimension so much. I think maybe because folk style kind of doesn't incentivize it as much, right? Freestyle, you don't have to hold the guy, you just expose him 4 points, you know, and so we did a lot more feet to back stuff, firemen's, you know, 2-on-1 Polish step arounds, inside trips. Not that we didn't, you know, cover all that stuff in Stillwater, but I just think there was more of an emphasis on it with Sergey.
How do you prepare for twice during your career you got to go into Carver Hawkeye Arena, and regardless of technique or what you have, they're going to want blood? How do you prepare for that?
Man, you might be asking the wrong guy. I don't think I ever won in Carver Hawkeye. So no, but it was tough, man. I mean, I got to say, it's definitely the hardest place I've ever wrestled. I'll never forget it. You know, I had a hard time making. I probably should have never been 125. I probably should have been 33, maybe even a 41 pounder. But you know, what was best for the team? I went down, you know, and I can remember having a really hard weight cut my sophomore year and having to wrestle Matt McDonough. And, you know, he was tough, right? We had a match the year before my freshman year in Stillwater, and it was really competitive, maybe like 7-4, 7-5, something like that. And then, you know, so I'm expecting like, all right, you know, this will be a tough match, right? I know this is a hard weight cut, but let's suck it up, right? And I'll never forget this. Most tired I've ever been in my life. After the, you know, first period, we're scrapping. I'm kind of like, oh man, I'm getting a little tired. And right at the end of the first period, they called me for stalling, and the place went crazy. And I'll never forget this. The whistle blows, and I was so exhausted after that first period that I'm like, I didn't know where our bench was. I didn't know which side we were on, any of that. And I'm like, oh man. It was the only time in my whole wrestling career where I'm like, all right, I'm in survival mode here, you know. And give Matt McDonough credit. That was probably the worst beating I've ever taken. I think he ended up majoring me, but yeah, it's a tough place to wrestle, man. They get on you, right? You take one step back, they're yelling, and it was fun though, man. You know, we got to really some pretty exciting dual meets. You know, like I think one year, maybe that sophomore year, they were trying to beat our undefeated record or our winning streak maybe. And so we tied them, right? And we broke their winning streak, but they still didn't lose the whole next year. So they had, you know, an undefeated streak, right? Where they didn't have the winning streak, but they hadn't lost either because of the tie. So then we broke that and we beat them. And it was like our records that they were trying to get, you know, and that's, when you have Oklahoma State versus Iowa, you have some different situations like that. And now, of course, Penn State's, you know, throwing their name into that mix too. But yeah, man, it was, you know, cool to be a part of stuff like that. Even if, yeah, it's some bitter memories, right? I mean, wish I would have wrestled better against Iowa, but you know, give those guys credit, man. There's some tough competitors, man, between McDonough and Tony Ramos. So,
what's your philosophy with your club there at Capital?
Yeah, I mean, just like I was saying earlier, you know, I think I try to, number one, make it fun, right? If I can't keep these kids coming back, we got no chance, right? So I think that's one thing in wrestling. Retention is poor, and it's like something that people just accept, you know, and it's like, this is how it is for wrestling. Well, it doesn't have to be like that, you know? You have to make it fun for the kids, right? So even if, you know, I try to tell nobody's going to care if you win Tulsa Nationals when you're 8 or 9 years old. Trust me. I've done it. Nobody cares, you know? So my whole thing is, let's give them the chance to be successful later. Not everybody's going to end up being a state champ or a national champ, but I want them to at least, number one, say they had a good experience and they had fun here. And, you know, when they're 14 or 15 years old and it's time to really pick it up, if they do want, you know, to be really, really elite in this sport, they have a good foundation and the right attitude, right? Because that's the main thing, is like, you want these kids to love competing, you know, and putting on a show. If you see too many of these kids, it's almost like it's almost like their dads scar them, you know, because they're so focused on the results and they're like on top of them. And it's like, that's not fun for anybody. I wouldn't want to do that. You know, that was one thing. My dad pushed me when I was young. But I think he did a really good job of never making it results oriented, you know? And I think, you know, that made a big difference why I still love wrestling so much and why I'm still involved in the sport. I think if, you know, I was so hard on myself already and I already expected so much out of myself. So if I think my dad would have been one of these guys who was like, hey, you should have done this, 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 and this, I'm like, I'm already beating myself up because I lost this match, you know? And it's such a simple thing, but you tell some of these dads and it's like, you think he went out there and he's like, hey, his thought process was, I'm going to lay an egg here and just really disappoint the hell out of my dad. And they're like, well, no, you know, when you think about it like that, it's kind of eye-opening, but for whatever reason, people don't. So I guess, does that kind of answer your question? I want to give them a chance at long-term success, you know? So if that means we have to sacrifice a little bit of winning at the beginning, I'm fine with that. I'd honestly I'd rather have the kids not compete until they were 9 or 10 years old, you know?
Well, take that a step further for me, if you would, because it seems like in the last 5 years, maybe I'm just more aware of hearing it, but it seems like you hear that it's not about results. It's more about effort-based philosophy. But I don't ever remember hearing that growing up. Do you think it's just a trend that people are getting that and it's getting out there with social media? What do you think that is?
I think, yeah, I mean, if you really listen to people who know the sport, right, it's like you listen to a Cael Sanderson interview, you listen to, you know, a John Smith interview. I listened to a few weeks ago, Doug Schwab talking about coaching his boys. And it's like, you're not going to win anything of any consequence when you're this age, you know? So I think people are finally like, okay, if all the, you know, best coaches and best wrestlers in the sport are saying this, it has to be true. Now, just being in the thick of it, right? It's like, it sounds good in theory, but then these dads, or some of the parents, right? They can't take it. It's like they're bought in, but then on Saturday or Sunday at the tournament, when they don't see the result they want, it's such like people want gratification now, right? And they can't, and with wrestling, it's like, sometimes you're not going to see that, right? You could keep making deposits and you may not cash out for 2, 3, 4 years. I mean, I could remember, you know, I grew up wrestling with Andrew Howe. You know, Andrew ended up, you know, making the Olympic trials finals twice, 4-time All-American, NCAA champ. He was not one of the better kids in our club growing up. You know, I mean, I hope he doesn't get mad at me saying that, but he wasn't. I mean, you know, but he freaking worked. You know, he was the first one in, last one out. And maybe he didn't see those results in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, but he kept coming back. And then all of a sudden, freshman year, it was like that light went on, and he's one of the best high school wrestlers in the country, you know, and he ends up being 3 or 4-time state champ, wins Fargo, all that, you know. So that's what I tell the kids. It's like, you never know when that light is going to go on for you, right? So, you know, if you quit, you'll never find out, right? But if you keep coming back and keep making those deposits, and, you know, maybe you get to be 15, 16 and you say, hey, wrestling's not for me. We have some kids that come into the club. One of my favorite kids, you know, he decided this year he got to be a freshman, and he's like, hey, you know, I like lacrosse better. And he wanted to focus on lacrosse. And I'm like, hey man, that's great. You know, I told him and his dad, but don't feel like you wasted that time, because number one, the work ethic you get from wrestling, you know, the baseline athleticism, I mean, that's going to translate to anything. And you know, it sounds corny or whatever, but I really believe that, you know, you go through different things in life, right? But, you know, once you've been through wrestling and really competed at a high level and kind of, you know, felt failure, right? I mean, you learn how to fail with wrestling. That's the number one thing I think that wrestling has to teach people, is it, you know, it teaches you how to be a man, right? You fail, you know, you could feel sorry for yourself and throw the towel in, or, you know, you could get back up, put one foot in front of the other, and kind of have that, you know, blue collar mentality. And you know, I think you take that from wrestling. No matter how good you are, right, you're going to have failures. You know, Kyle Dake, 4-time national champ, he's, you know, had his heart ripped out losing to Jordan Burroughs a few times, right? Jordan Burroughs has had his heart ripped out losing to the Russian Sidikov a few times. So it's like, no matter how much you accomplish in this sport, you're going to have failure, So I think that persistence and just, learning how to pick yourself up is like what I really think wrestling teaches kids.
Take me through the psyche of that parent that wants their 8-year-old kid to win all of the tournaments and nationals. What drives them? Like, what goes into their head and their thinking?
Man, that's $1 million question. If I knew, I'm not sure, right? It's like, I think, some of it's human nature, competitiveness. And then I think some of it is maybe their, maybe they want to see their kids accomplish things that maybe they didn't accomplish, and they have those regrets. And the thing is, most of them are not malicious, right? It's like they're good people. They care about their kids. They want to see the best for their kids, and they just get too caught up in the moment, So it's like, that's what I try to tell these dads. I'm like, man, step back and just really think about how you're treating your son or daughter, and usually when you do that, and nobody's perfect, right? I mean, I get mad at kids once in a while, but I just think, if you have that overarching, if it's coming from a good place, which most of these parents are, I mean, you could talk to them. And then I think that's where, having good coaching comes in, right? Where I could tell these dads, like, hey, you got to step back, and most of them, they pay the money to come to the club. And I tell them, like, hey, you pay me because you trust that I'm a good coach and I know what I'm talking about, right? And they go, right. And I go, so you got to listen to me on this, and most of the time it works. A big thing we've done is, it was tough. Like, the kids, they look, and I think it's just that age, right? They want their parents' approval so much that they're like looking, and the dads are right on top of them. And so what we started doing was I keep them all in the waiting room, but then what happens is they're all right up on the window, and the kids are looking over like this. So I finally put in some blinds, and when we're doing drilling and technique or warm up and that kind of stuff, they can watch practice. But when we do live wrestling, I shut those blinds, and I got that from Sean at Overtime. And it made a big difference for me growing up. It's like, you don't have to spend that hour car ride home for some of these kids, like with your dad drilling you. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do this? And it made it an environment of learning, and just, again, I know I keep saying that, but development, instead of so much about like, okay, why didn't you win today in practice? Why didn't you do this on little Johnny? And that's tough, man, when you have that constant expectation. I mean, so I think it gives them, a chance. I almost think like the kids that are really good when they're young, I almost think they're good when they're older in spite of it, not because of it. You get what I'm saying? I think it's almost like a detriment to have these. I think it's like dog years, really. Wrestling's hard, man. Wrestling's hard, and if you don't have people that really look at it with the long-term goals in sight, I think, you do yourself a disservice.
How do you handle a parent that wants their kid to win that tournament and puts them in the sauna and wants them to make weight? Do you have conversations? You just let them go and do their thing?
No, so I'm not going to be associated with that as a wrestling club, and that's something I feel pretty strongly about. You want to burn a kid and run them out of the sport. Easiest way to do it is cutting weight, and there's just no need for it. I mean, even at the senior level, I'm like, that's what I try to tell these parents. I'm like, the best wrestler is going to win. Again, going back to it, the skill is what's going to win for you, right? I mean, Frank Chamizo, the guy started at 55 kilos. Now he's all the way up at 74. That's from 121 pounds to 163. And he looks kind of like he's a little bit, fluffy at 74 kilos, but it's like, does he keep cutting down to 65 or go up to 74, where he feels good and wrestling is fun? And that's one thing I took from college. It's really, really hard to focus on cutting weight and getting better at wrestling at the same time. So it's, number one, it'll burn kids out of the sport. And number two, it stunts their development, because they're so worried about, okay, how much have I lost in this practice? Have I, lost 3 or 4 pounds, instead of, have I figured out this high crotch finish, or have I figured out how to get out of the single wrist, So I think just helping them understand. And I think you have to talk to them, you know, I mean, again, that's kind of, and that's what I was talking about earlier. Their on the mat stuff is easy, you know, but kind of learning how to communicate with the parents and manage the relationships between the parents and the kids and make sure that, you know, everybody's getting what they want out of this. It's, you know, it's not easy, right? So I wish there was like a magic answer, but I think what you got to do is just try to communicate with them and, you know, and explain things, right? They want to know why.